Great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you. I must admit, it is a little bit strange. This isn't the first one meeting like this that I've done, but basically I just get to spend the next hour talking to myself, looking at pictures that I've prepared in a presentation. And it's a little bit strange having the lack of interaction with an audience. So bear with me, I'm sure it'll be fine. So I'm going to give you a bit of a talk about beekeeping in Mid Wales. It's not essentially vastly different from beekeeping in the middle of England, but there are a few subtle differences which I'll talk about. And then I'm just going to talk about some of the experiences that I've had this season. Of course, every season is different, so we'll just have a bit of a chat about some of that as well. So this picture that you can see here on the screen at the moment, this is one of my apiaries. This is at the bottom of my garden. It looks like everything's on a bit of a skew width, but I can assure you that the hive stands are level. My husband would never let me get away with having things on a dodgy angle. So you can see the sun is shining in this picture, and that's very typical of where I live, where it does seem to be during lockdown anyway. So a little bit about me. The picture is a slightly younger version of me, and certainly under the current lockdown scenario, my hair's grown a bit as well. I've been keeping bees now since 2005, currently running about 25-ish hives. You know how it is in the summer where it's difficult to give a figure because it depends on how many splits you've had to do that week. I'm lucky to have a lot of help from my husband with my beekeeping. He's incredibly tolerant of my hobby. And it's certainly useful when it comes to certain jobs that need an extra pair of hands. So that is a massive help. And I'm sure those of you who beekeep as either a partnership with a partner or maybe a friend, greatly appreciate having that extra pair of hands. So I do all my own queen rearing and also raise a few nukes, and these I'll sell or use for my own use. And that really, I think, is an essential thing for developing your beekeeping and taking it on to a different level. During the introductions, it was mentioned that I am a master beekeeper, and last year I achieved my national diploma in beekeeping. So I'm sure some of you are aware that it's quite an undertaking, and obviously I'm really pleased to have achieved that. So I just want to say just literally a few words about the national diploma. It has a historical background in county beekeeping training. So historically around the country, each county would have had a county beekeeper, and they would have been responsible for training beekeepers in their area. Hazel, you might just want to switch your microphone off, thank you. And then these county beekeepers would have been responsible for training the beekeepers in their area. But of course, as funding cuts were brought in, this was lost. And so the NDB set up as an independent organisation to try and fill this void and continue training beekeepers to a high level. So some of you may have been on some of the short courses that are available, and there aren't any running at the moment due to a slight lack of funding, but hopefully we'll be able to resume those. So do keep a lookout for those short courses that take place around the country. And then also once a year, there's an advanced course that runs in Pershore College in Worcestershire, and that's a really lovely opportunity to come together with a group of like-minded beekeepers and really immerse yourself in some very high-level training and education about beekeeping. And hopefully then that will lead on to taking the NDB exam. So it's not a straightforward undertaking. It does require a lot of commitment, but it is very well worth it if anyone is interested. Okay, so that's enough about the NDB. Back to Mid Wales. So This is where I live, in Devil's Bridge, right in the middle of Wales. Some of you may be more familiar with the national parks of Mid Wales. You might have visited Snowdonia, maybe Pembrokeshire, or the Brecon Beacons. But actually, very few people actually come into Mid Wales. It's a bit of a hidden gem, and certainly under our current situation, we're extremely grateful of that. So I'm about 10 miles inland from Aberystwyth. Aberystwyth is my local town. It's a university town, which some of you may have visited or be aware of because of the university there. And also it houses the National Library of Wales, which very fortunately for me houses the Eva Crane collection of beekeeping books. So that's a great resource on my doorstep. So this picture here is taken literally just 50 yards from my garden, and this is very typical of the scenery here in Mid Wales. We are very much an upland area, and these hanging oak valleys are really typical of the area. Also typical landscape in this area are sheep. So there are probably more, well, there are definitely more sheep in Wales than there are people. And so that creates a landscape that is dominated by pastoral agriculture, so grass effectively. And it's surprisingly not that great for beekeeping because there used to be a lot of clovers, white clover in particular, in the pastures. But as new and more productive grasses were developed, they have become the dominant species, and there's less and less clover. But interestingly, now we are seeing a bit of a shift back towards using legumes within pastures because of the benefits they bring, both nutritionally and for their nitrogen fixing qualities, which means farmers don't need to use so much nitrogen. We are starting to see more being used. So hopefully that will also benefit us beekeepers. But certainly in terms of, you know, forage in the spring at the moment, it's the trees that are really important for us in this area. And then in the summer, it's, you know, it's very much a more wildflower type scenario. But I'll come on to talk a bit more about the forage that my bees are utilising in a minute. It's also worth saying I am 10 miles from the coast. I do keep some bees up here, as the first picture I showed you. So I'm probably about 600 or 700 feet above sea level here in Devil's Bridge, maybe even a little bit higher than that. I do have two apiaries up here in Devil's Bridge, and then I have several out apiaries between here and Aberystwyth on the coast. So I have bees at varying altitudes, and it's really interesting to see how the different apiaries perform quite differently. So this is quite an amusing slide. I just thought that I would show you the difference in rainfall between where I live and where you live. So even the difference between Devil's Bridge and Aberystwyth, so literally within sort of 10 or 12 miles of each other, you'll see it's the difference between 60 inches of rainfall up here in Devil's Bridge every year compared to just over 40 in Aberystwyth. But compare that with yourselves in Buckinghamshire, and that then drops to 30 inches. So as you can see, it's quite wet here in Wales. But it's not just the annual rainfall that's of significance. It's the number of wet days per year that I find most amusing. And of course, what this means that on a wet day, bees can't forage. So even if we had much higher rainfall, but all that rain just fell on a few days, that wouldn't have much of an impact on us. But of course, our rainfall is spread out over all year, basically. And so that does have quite an impact on the bees, particularly if we have a wet spell during their peak foraging time. And we're certainly seeing changes in the patterns of weather, just as you are, I'm sure. And in the summer we may get spells of very warm weather, but if it's wet at the same time, then clearly that's not going to be much good. Interestingly, we're undergoing an incredibly dry spell at the moment, which is really not typical for mid Wales. We haven't had any significant rain here for 2 months now, and it's impacting quite heavily on the farming systems in the area. I don't think it's impacting too much on the bees at the moment. We did have a very wet winter, so hopefully there's enough of a reserve of moisture in the soil just to keep the trees going at the moment. But it'll be interesting to see how it pans out from here on. So I just wanted to talk to you about the difference between polystyrene hives and wooden hives. It's only in the last probably 18 months that I've started using a couple of polystyrene hives. I only have 2 of them. And really, I started using them because quite a lot of beekeepers in the area were starting to use them, and they were constantly asking me, what did I think of polystyrene hives? And I couldn't actually answer that question because I'd never used them before, apart from polystyrene nuke boxes that I do use. And so I thought, well, I've really got to get a couple and see for myself what I think. So it's too early to make any firm judgments on whether they're better or not. Certainly our bee inspectors in this area say that after a very poor winter, it tends to be the colonies in the polystyrene hives that are doing better. But I've not seen any real difference between my polystyrene hives and my wooden hives. I must admit, I prefer handling the bees in the wooden hives, but I think that's just because I'm more used to being able to lever my hive tool against the wood and feel confident that I'm not going to put a dent in it. Even though the polystyrene hives are this very dense polystyrene, I still do feel a little bit nervous about, putting dents in it and causing nicks in it as I'm using my hive tool. So at the moment, the majority of my hives are on wooden, but yeah, like I say, I'm just trying out a couple of polystyrene ones just to see how they compare. So I just thought I'd have a bit of a discussion now about the forage that my bees are accessing throughout the year. And the pictures I've put up here are an apple orchard, oilseed rape, and some field beans then down in the bottom left-hand corner. And I'm guessing, I may be wrong, but I'm guessing this is the type of forage that some of you will be accessing and will certainly be quite familiar with. So apart from the apples, I don't see field beans and oilseed rape at all. I actually have to drive 50 miles to see the nearest oilseed rape crops. And field beans, goodness knows, I'm not aware of any in Wales, but I'm sure there are some somewhere. But certainly in mid Wales, there are none. Mid Wales is an upland area, and we don't have arable crops here. The apples in the area wouldn't be commercial apple orchards, it would just be apple trees that are in people's gardens. So these types of forages that I'm showing here are not what I'm using at all. So in the spring, so now, I don't know if I can close that. No, I don't want to do that. Okay, so I'm sorry, the picture is slightly covered by the things in the top right hand corner. So in the picture in the top right hand corner is some of this hanging oak woodland, which is really interesting because you quite often hear that oak is of actually no benefit at all to bees, but that's recently been proved to be incorrect by a study that was undertaken at the National Botanic Gardens in Wales. And they did some DNA barcoding of all the different pollens that were being brought into the hive and were present in the honey. And they found that oak is actually prevalent in many, many hives, many of the nectars, many of the honeys, sorry. And it was quite interesting because back in the early spring, when the oak was in full flower, we were out walking here and we could hear one of the oak trees absolutely buzzing, and it was quite a warm evening, and the oak tree was absolutely alive with honeybees working the catkins within the oak tree, collecting the pollen. So the picture in the top left-hand corner there is the sycamore, and this is out in flower at the moment, and my bees are certainly working this quite well. We had some really high winds over the weekend, which was quite annoying because it knocked a lot of the sycamore blossom off the trees. Yeah, hopefully the bees have managed to get most of what they want. And then the picture in the bottom is hawthorn, another really important tree for the bees, and that's just finishing flowering in this area. We tend to have hawthorn a little bit later here in the uplands, and certainly down nearer the coast in Aberystwyth it probably was out about a month ago. So we have had a slightly sort of protracted flowering of the hawthorn in this area. And then, you know, there'll be other things that the bees will be accessing in the early spring. The holly has finished flowering now. That's quite an important species, tree species for the bees. And then, of course, blackthorn and other cherry and other apple and top fruit species. So then, moving into the summer, a lot of what my bees will be foraging on are wildflowers, and that will mostly be in the sort of hedgerows and some of the field margins. As I said before, a lot of the fields are very bare, sort of green billiard boards that are grazed by sheep and cattle. But certainly in some of the less densely stocked areas, there'll be quite nice wildflower areas. This picture here has some self-heal and eyebright in it, as well as the yellow plant there. In the bottom right-hand corner of that picture is some bird's foot trefoil, and these are all really good plants for bees. The picture in the middle is bramble, and that is probably one of my biggest honey crops. So, you know, bramble is really, really important in this area. And then clover as well, not as important as it used to be. And certainly if you talk to some of the older beekeepers, they'll remember when they were getting big honey crops off of clover. But unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. And then moving into the autumn, we have the rosebay willow herb on the left. Again, really, really important plant for honey. That's with the bramble. That's probably, you know, my biggest honey crop. And it comes out. I've put it here as an autumn plant, but of course it probably starts flowering in July. So really, it sort of crosses that summer-autumn span. Then the Himalayan balsam, which interestingly is an invasive plant, and Natural Resource Wales, which is kind of the equivalent of Natural England. They're actually trying to eradicate this in some of the river catchments, including the one that's closest to me here. They're not succeeding very well. There are some areas where there's still quite a lot of Himalayan balsam to be found. And of course the bees love it. So it's one of those plants that, while you know it shouldn't be there, you're kind of glad to see it as well. And then ivy, as we move into the late autumn, another really important plant for the bees, and they'll take good advantage of that on the warm late autumn days, as well as many other pollinating insects, as I'm sure you're aware. So those, you know, that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the forages that my bees will be accessing, and as I pointed out at the beginning, you know, they're all very much based on wildflowers. We're not able to take advantage of any arable crops here. So whereas some of you might be sort of maybe even moving your bees from oilseed rape onto field beans, may even have access to borage in some areas, you know, none of that is available to our bees up here. So you know, I'm not complaining. We produce, well, we might not have the same level of honey yields that you're getting in some areas. What we produce here is a really high quality wildflower honey, and you know, I'm quite happy with that. So I can't really do a talk about beekeeping in Wales without mentioning heather. This picture here shows ling heather and also the bell heather, which is the slightly darker, bigger flowers. So there are areas of Wales where they produce a lot of heather honey, but interestingly, it's not particularly good area here for it. The heather tends to grow in this area above 2,000 feet, and that's purely grazing pressure from the number of sheep that we have in the area. So at 2,000 feet, what do you have? You have a lot more rain, and you know, temperatures are a lot cooler. So of course those are not ideal for honey gathering for the bees. So heather isn't a particularly big crop in this particular area. You'd really need to go to the eastern areas where there are sort of lower heather moors that would be much more accessible to honeybees. So I thought I'd spend a bit of time now just talking about some of the things that I focus on as a beekeeper, and hopefully you'll be able to relate to some of these and you know, maybe compare with what you're doing yourselves. So for me, my main emphasis is on having strong, healthy colonies, and rather than focus on having a high honey crop every year, if you focus on having strong, healthy colonies, then the honey crop will come as a byproduct of that. So I kind of find that it's better to have your focus from the bottom up rather than the top down, if that makes sense. So I do make weekly inspections. I work full time, and so my beekeeping is confined to evenings and weekends. And so it's really important for me to be doing those inspections on a regular basis, and that would be every weekend. And I will be, you know, making sure that I'm on top of my swarm control so that I'm not losing bees unnecessarily, and that then I can try and keep my colonies as big and healthy as possible without them swarming out and just depleting themselves. Varroa control is a really important part of what I do. And again, you know, if you can keep on top of Varroa, that will ensure your colonies are strong and healthy, and then that results in good honey crops. And then also through doing my own queen rearing, I can make sure that I've got young queens in all of my colonies. So certainly every other year I'll be looking to replace queens. This year I'm going to replace a few more than I normally would, and I'll come on to explain some of the reasons behind that in a minute. So Varroa control for me is the general sort of pattern behind what I'm doing is I'll be doing oxalic acid vaporization in the winter, and then again I'll be doing it after the honey crop. So for a few years now I've only used the oxalic acid vaporization. I haven't used any of the other chemical treatments, and I just, you know, I do monitor and keep an eye on Varroa levels, and this seems to be working quite well for me at the moment. There may come a time when it doesn't work so well, and through monitoring I'll be able to pick that up, and it may be that I'll need to change my methods. But at the moment this still seems to be working quite well. So I found that my broodless period in December is probably a little bit earlier than originally we were taught to think. Quite often people would say do your oxalic acid treatment in the winter around about Christmas, but I found that actually the broodless period tends to be sort of end of November, early December time. So I try and do my winter treatment now at the beginning of December. And the simplest thing to do is just to open up a few colonies. Even if it's a cold day, you're not going to be in there very long, so you're not going to cause a problem. Just pull out a few of the frames in the middle of the brood box and see if there's any brood on them. Technically, if there is, you should be opening that brood before you do your vaporization, and that ensures really high success rate then. I do 2 treatments then in the winter, 10 to 14 days apart. And then after the honey crop, I'll go back in again with the same method. If I do still have supers on at this time of year, there'll be supers that I'll be leaving on for the winter. I tend to overwinter with 1 brood box and 1 super. So if there is any supers on when I do the oxalic acid treatment, I don't need to worry about that because it's not honey that I'm going to be collecting. And because there will be brood in the brood box at this time of year, even though this method isn't recommended when you have brood in there, I'll do maybe 2 or 3 treatments a week apart, just to catch the new varroa mites as they're emerging with the new brood. So I've found that this is quite a good way of just mopping up any varroa mites in the colony. Now, I'll also be using some of the integrated pest management techniques. A bit of a shameless plug now. The picture there shows the new BBKA News special issue booklet on integrated pest management, and I put this booklet together for the BBKA, and I've written some of the articles in this booklet along with some other master beekeepers that I got to help out on it. So do have a look at that booklet just to get an idea of some of the different techniques that are available to beekeepers to help them manage varroa. So it's really important with your varroa control that you're not just relying on chemical treatments, because clearly that's not a good place to be. We need to try and limit the number of chemicals that we're putting into our hives, not just because we're producing a natural wholesome product, but because some of those products the varroa mites will become resistant to if they're used excessively or if they're used inappropriately. So by utilizing some of the integrated pest management techniques, the non-chemical techniques, then we're able to prolong the life of some of these chemical treatments so that they're just used in the more serious cases or as a last resort. So having open mesh floors is one of these techniques, and I have open mesh floors on all of my hives. And then I also do some drone brood removal. I'll show you the technique that I've been using this year in a minute. And then I'll also do some shook swarming early in the season as a method of comb change. And that also works really well for varroa control, because with a shook swarm, you're taking away all the old brood there and then. You're not allowing it to emerge before you remove the old comb. And so that has the benefit of taking away any varroa mites that are trapped within that comb, and is a really good way of just helping to clean out the colony early in the season. You can take it a step further as well after you've done the shook swarm. Before the first round of brood is sealed, you can treat them with oxalic acid as well, and that really will be a very effective varroa control early in the season. So this is a method of drone brood trapping that you can do. So what you do is you start off, the picture on the left shows an ordinary deep frame from the brood box, and you split it into 3 sections. You then put it into a hive. It does help if the hive is quite strong, and they'll draw drone brood within that comb. They're always quite keen to draw drone brood, and I just put some very tiny starter strips along the top. It's not actually essential to use starter strips, but I just thought I'd just get them going. And then place this frame towards the edge of the brood nest, and literally within a week, this is what they'd done. The picture on the right shows how they had drawn it all out into drone brood, and it was all laid up as well. So what I did after 1 week was I removed 2 of the sections. So the picture on the right, on the left, I've removed the first section, and then the picture on the right, I've removed the second section. The third section is all laid up. There are larvae in there, and I left that in place then. So the following week, I came back, and the section that I had left is now capped, and then they'd drawn out the other 2 sections, again with drone brood. So the picture on the right, I then removed one of the sections, so the section on the far left, and I've left the middle section in place. And that was last weekend. So what I'll do now next weekend is I'll remove the section that's capped before those drones emerge. That's really important. You have to remove that before the drones emerge so that they don't release the varroa back into the colony. And when I cut out that section of capped drones, I'll be able to bring it home and actually assess it for varroa levels as well. And that will give me a really good indication as to the varroa levels in this colony, and whether I need to continue with this technique, or whether I can then just remove it and leave them get on with their normal activities. So there are obviously several schools of thought about drone brood culling, because effectively you're encouraging the bees to build a lot of comb, and then you're just cutting it out, so that feels like a bit of a wasted resource. And also you don't want to cull out all the drone in the colony. So there is other drone brood within this colony on the edges of other frames, which I'm not taking from them. I'm just purely doing it on this frame as a way of monitoring the varroa levels, but also then removing some varroa from that colony. So I'll be able to see, hopefully in the next week or so, how effective this method is, and whether I'm actually whether it's worth doing if the colony has quite high levels of varroa, or whether I don't need to do it anymore. So unfortunately, I'm doing this talk kind of halfway through the process, so I can't tell you how it's gone this season. So I thought it might also be interesting to talk to you about some other observations that I've made this year, so early in this spring. So in January and February this year, we had an incredibly wet winter. Even by wet Welsh standards, it was incredibly wet. And I'm sure that impacted on the bees. And so even though I had very few winter losses, just 2 colonies out of 27, I did have 2 apiaries in the spring that I noticed were very slow to build up. Now, if I only had those 2 apiaries, I probably wouldn't have noticed that there was anything wrong. But because I had other apiaries that literally were, I had massive colonies that were building up incredibly quickly, and by the end of April, some of those I had 4 supers on, that was a really good indicator to me that in these other 2 apiaries, there was something not quite right. So on closer inspection, I had some nosema in those colonies, and also a little bit of sac brood. So the 2 pictures that I've put on this slide, the one on the top is sac brood, and the one on the bottom is showing the nosema spores. So just concentrating on nosema a bit, this is really characterized by very poor spring build-up. So your colony might come through the winter and you think, fantastic, you know, I've got through the winter, I've done the difficult bit. And then as it starts to build up, maybe sort of late March into April, you may notice that actually it's not building up, and you just seem to be sort of hovering about on 3 to 4 frames. It's never really getting any bigger. You might also see some fecal staining on some of the frames and around the entrance of the hive. And often these colonies have plenty of stores. So it kind of just makes you think, well, it's not that they haven't got food, they just don't seem to be doing anything with that food. And those are quite classic signs that maybe nosema is at play. So nosema is caused by a microsporidion. It's a spore-forming parasite that infects the epithelial cells of the gut, and it causes inflammation and diarrhea. And the problem with nosema is because bees, by their very nature, are very clean and tidy, they will actually clean up any mess that's made within the hive, and that includes any feces that might be on the combs. And of course, how do bees clean up? They use their mouth parts. So in cleaning away someone else's mess, they will then pick up the spores within those feces, and they then become infected themselves. So that's why comb changes are really important treatment for nosema, to get that dirty comb away from the bees. So what can you do about it? Well, the first thing I would suggest is to ask yourself whether the colony is worth saving. You can invest quite a lot of time and effort into trying to save a colony, but if it is so poor and so badly depleted that, you know, it's really not going to get any better, then I think I would probably just cut my losses. And certainly with one of my colonies, I did that. It was only on 2 or 3 frames. It clearly was failing, and it wasn't worth trying to do anything with it. So I just shook the bees out and took the comb away and rendered it down and cleaned up all the hive parts. But some of the other colonies were worth trying to do something with. So I did Bailey comb changes on those colonies, and I'll show you in a minute what I mean by that. And then other things that you need to do if you ever suspect nosema, and you should also be doing these anyway as a matter of course to hopefully avoid nosema ever becoming a problem. You need to be very clean in your activities. So make sure you clean your hive tools, preferably between hives during inspections, but certainly between apiaries. Clean comb is really important, so you need to be thinking about a regular program of comb changes to make sure that your bees are not on dark, soiled, infected combs. And then don't move equipment between apiaries. You know, this is sometimes a little bit difficult when people are running more than one apiary, but if you can, wherever possible, think of it as an apiary, as a complete unit, and keep equipment dedicated to each apiary. So this is a diagrammatic scheme of a Bailey comb change for a weak colony that was infected with nosema. So I'll just try and talk you through it. I think you can see my cursor moving. So what I've got here at the bottom, so this is the original colony with all the old frames. Some of these frames have got brood in them, and then there might be a little bit of stores. If there are any frames at the outer edge of the colony that aren't being used, then remove those and use dummy boards. Then, so by dummy boards, I mean blank wooden boards that you can basically then just make the colony appear smaller. make the hive appear smaller. So they're not trying to warm up a space that's really massive. And then what you do is you close the old entrance and you find the queen in here and you put her on the frame that you found her on into the new box of sterile comb and foundation in the top box. You have a queen excluder between the two boxes, and you have an eek with a new entrance between the two boxes. So now the bees, they very quickly find the new entrance because it's directly above where the old entrance was. And the bees will come and go from this entrance and they'll track straight up into the new box. And you end up with very little traffic on the old dirty frames. And that's what you want to avoid. You'll need to feed this colony, give them a small feed so that they can draw any foundation that you've put in here. But also because they might be slightly weakened and not have many foraging bees, just giving them a feed just kind of takes that job away from them for the short term. So then what you do a week later is you can go back into this and hopefully the queen will have laid up some of the other combs, and then you can remove this old dirty comb here, taking care not to remove the queen, and you can get rid of that, put another frame of sterilized comb or foundation in its place. And then you wait 3 weeks until all of the brood down here has emerged, and then you can just remove this box completely and reinstate the entrance at the bottom. You can replace the floor with a clean one and replace the crown board and the roof with clean ones as well. So now all the equipment is clean and the bees are on fresh, clean comb or foundation that they're drawing out. And so this is a really gentle way of getting the bees onto new comb, and then they don't have to track and walk over the dirty comb, and then you can just remove that and render it down and reuse the equipment once you've sterilized it all. So it's quite an effective method. It does take 3 to 4 weeks to complete the entire process because you're waiting for all the brood to emerge in the bottom box. But you know, it's a nice gentle method because you really don't want to be stressing these bees out, because if you stress them in any way, they'll just defecate on your new combs in the top box, and then you're straight back into the old scenario of having dirty combs again. So that's what I did with some of my colonies, and you know, that was very successful. But what I'm also going to do with those colonies is requeen them as soon as I've got some new queens this year. So the other thing that I saw in some of my colonies, and again, this is quite possibly due to the very wet season we had over the winter, was I saw more sac brood this spring than I would normally do. And in the last probably 12 months, the bee inspectors have certainly been reporting more sac brood than normal. So I'm not really sure why that is. But it's caused by a virus which affects both the adults and the immature forms within the capped brood. And it forms this classic slipper-like shape. If I just show you on this picture here, it forms this sort of, the larvae in here has died, and this is sort of referred to as a Chinese slipper, where you have this upturned sort of snout at the end of the dead larvae, and you'll see them sat in the comb like that. So if you see several of those, they can sometimes be confused with both European and American foul brood, because they're affecting the brood, and the brood tends to look you know, quite brown and horrible. But the larvae that's died is contained within this sac, and that's where it gets its name from. And that's because it happens during one of the sort of molting stages of the larvae, and the molting doesn't take place properly. And the fluid in here is the molting fluid that's been secreted by the larvae, but the actual molt doesn't take place, and you just get this larvae contained within the sac. So it's quite often asymptomatic, and by that I mean it's quite often within a colony, but you won't see any sign of it. And that's you know, quite common, and it's only under times of stress then that you'll suddenly see more sign of it. And I think that's what's happened in some of my colonies this spring. It certainly is more commonly seen in spring, because that's when the bees are under greatest stress. They're just trying to build up. They're also trying to find forage and waiting for forage to come online after a long winter. And you know, any sort of stress will show itself quite often in the form of disease. It may also be seen in association with varroa. So if you're not keeping on top of your varroa control, you'll quite often see sac brood show up a bit then as well. So that's another really good reason to keep on top of varroa. So what can you do? Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, avoid stressors. So avoid food deficiencies and avoid high levels of varroa in your colonies, because these will certainly stress out the bees and allow them to exhibit symptoms of other things that may be going on and sort of rumbling in the background, but they're able to sort of manage it and keep on top of it until they get a little bit stressed, and then it just comes out to the fore. Requeen is really the main thing you can do here, and certainly that's what I'm in the process of doing now, is rearing some new queens ready to requeen these colonies that have been exhibiting signs of sac brood. And then hygienic practices are also really important. So this virus can be spread on combs. So maintaining clean combs and maintaining clean equipment is really important. So that's about it. I've absolutely no idea how long I've been talking for. Hopefully you're all still there. So as I've said a couple of times, the really important thing with beekeeping these days is to keep on top of varroa. If you control varroa and keep your bees in a nice, fit, healthy state, everything else will fall into place nicely. Hygienic practices are really important. They're important for controlling many of the diseases, not just nosema and sac brood that I've mentioned tonight, but also the foul broods as well. And also, you know, it's just good policy. Be clean and tidy in your apiary. Learn about the forage in your area. If you're not really aware of what your bees are foraging on, then take some time to investigate. You know, and you can just do this quite simply as you're driving about or walking about in your local area. Just keep an eye on what's coming into flower, and also whether bees or other pollinating insects are working those plants. And you'll very soon develop quite a good understanding of what's available in your locality and what your bees are using. You can take it a step further then by maybe doing some pollen analysis on pollen loads that are coming into the hive, or even pollen analysis of honey that you're collecting. It's not as simple as it sounds. It's while the process of doing the pollen analysis is quite simple, learning all the different pollens and being able to recognize them takes a bit of practice, but it's good fun, and I definitely recommend having a go. And I know that you've got a really good microscopy team within your area, so there's plenty of resource for you to be able to tap into there. But most importantly, of course, you know, enjoy your bees. And you know, certainly this year, in these crazy situation that we find ourselves in at the moment, and certainly in Wales, we're not ready to come out of lockdown yet, and we're a little way behind you guys in England. You know, I'm just making the most of it, really. Normally when I'm queen rearing, I'm having to look at my diary and fit queen rearing in around, you know, life, work and everything else. Well, this year my my diary is well and truly empty, and so it's making queen rearing much simpler. So that's it. I shall now, I'm happy to take any questions, so we'll have a look at the chat, but I think if I come out of my presentation and stop sharing the screen, then we'll be able to maybe look at the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lynfa. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We do have, and it's obviously you put a lot of work into preparing that presentation, so thank you for that. That's brilliant. We do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So who's being quite coy and not telling us, somebody called User says, Lynfa, do you breed hybrids or a specific strain of bees?
So I'm not on any specific strain of bees at all. They are very much a locally adapted bee. We do have a few people using the dark native bees in this area, and so some of my queens will come out a little bit dark and then some will come out quite yellow. So I'm more interested in a bee that's able to withstand the conditions that we have in this area. And so, you know, it's very much a locally adapted bee, but nothing special about it.
Okay, that's Arnold. Arnold Essander. He's another master beekeeper. So I think he knows. I think he probably does the same. Is anybody there? So there were some questions earlier. So when you showed that frame of putting getting them to draw out drone brood as part of integrated pest management, I think the question was, why do they build drone brood on it? Why wouldn't they build worker brood on it?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really interesting question, and certainly at this time of year when your colonies are quite strong and they're happy to build comb, they've got enough worker brood within the colony, and they're always looking to be able to build some drone comb. And so if you give them an opportunity by not providing them with foundation, they will nearly always build drone comb there. And that's clearly a response to what they want to do. They want some drones in their colony. The colonies are always much happier when they've got drones in the summer. And so it's effectively just a natural response to what they want to do.
Yeah, then I think because you put it on the edge of the brood nest, they want to put their drones around the outside.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question. Do you graft to make your queens or just split colonies?
I do graft, yeah. So I've got two cell raisers going at the moment where I'm raising some grafted larvae, and then I'll put those into apodias to get them mated.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people do around here as well. So here's Alan Roberts. I've read in the media about colony thefts in Wales. What precautions are being taken and what support are you getting from the police in these rural areas?
Yeah, so touch wood, I'm not aware of any colony thefts in this area, and I don't think the situation's any worse in Wales than it is anywhere else in the UK. But yeah, I'm not aware of any kind of specific support from the police. But as I say, we haven't had any any thefts that I'm aware of in this area. So it's just a case of being vigilant yourself. You know, if you set up an out apiary, you need to think about where it is. Is it, you know, out of view of, you know, sort of passers-by, away from public footpaths, away from tracks where people could access them quite easily, and, you know, just think generally about a bit of security.
Yeah. So practically, when going back to the drone brood, can you talk through how you analyse that brood you remove, and from a practical perspective, how soon after removal do you analyse? Yeah,
so if I just click on this, so this sealed frame of brood, what you need to do is leave it until effectively it's at the sort of pink eye stage is what we call it. So the drones within it are formed enough to be able to hold their shape. So when you open them, you don't just end up with a lot of white mush. And then you just run an uncapping fork under the cappings and just lift them out. And you'll see then the varroa on the larvae, or on the developing pupae inside. And so the recommendation then is to uncap about 100 cells and see how many are infected with varroa. If you refer to the National Bee Unit's information on varroa control, it talks about this in their booklet, which they updated in January this year. And so that's what I'll do, is I'll just uncap the seal brood this weekend when I go down to the colony, and I'll just have a look and see how many of the cells are infected. And I can't remember now off the top of my head, so I will have to refer to the booklet myself just to check, you know, what sort of level they suggest is a problem, and if it's above that, then I'll need to do, you know, consider whether I need to do some varroa control, but hopefully it'll be of a low enough level that I won't need to do anything. Certainly the colony is quite strong, so I'm not anticipating that there's a huge problem in there.
Right. Now here's a question from Fran. Have you found your bees have tried to swarm more than usual this spring?
No, I wouldn't say more than usual. No, we had quite a nice warm spell, as I'm sure you did as well, in April. And so we did have bees building up really quickly in April, and I did need to do some swarm control by the end of April. May has been a lot cooler with us, and not particularly wet, but certainly a lot cooler. And so that's just kind of checked their swarming activities a bit. But now this week, again, it's going to warm up. So it'll certainly be a case of keeping an eye on the colonies again and make sure they're not starting to think about swarm tendencies again.
Okay. I think there's one more question. Oh yes, this is again from Arnold. Do you, when you've got your new queens, do you take them through winter before introducing them to colonies, or do you introduce them before winter?
Well, some and some really. So this year, because of the problems that I've had in a couple of apiaries with nosema and sac brood, I'll be requeening all of those colonies as soon as I get mated queens. So those ones obviously I'll do this year. I have a couple of red queens still, so those ones need replacing, so they'll get done this year. And then any others that I think, any colonies that aren't performing too great, I'll get and requeen them if I have any spare queens. And then if I have any spare ones again, I'll take a few nukes through the winter. I'll take them through the winter as nukes, and then I've got options in the spring if I have any that come out of the winter, either as drone layers, or, you know, maybe the queen dies or something. So you just got a few options up your sleeve then.
Okay, that's brilliant. I think we've come up to the end of the questions, and it's really good to talk to a knowledgeable and practical beekeeper, because it's all very well reading the books, but actually you actually need to get your hands dirty and get down there and do it. So that's great. So thank you very much, Lynfa, for doing that.
You're very welcome. If I can work out how to stop sharing the screen, I can do that, and then I can actually pause. Oh, that's pause. Stop sharing. There we go.
Try that. That's it.
That's
well done.
it. There we go.
Thank you everyone for joining. Have a good evening. It's still light enough to go and have a look in the apiary. So we'll hopefully see you all next month. Thank you very much, Lynfa. Bye.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.